The howling wind threatened to tear the wooden schoolhouse from its foundation as 26-year-old Abigail Thornton huddled beneath her heavy woolen coat, watching the last of the oil in her lamp burn dangerously low. 3 days into the worst blizzard to hit the Dakota Territory in 30 years, she had already burned the last of her firewood and eaten the final scraps of food she had packed for what was supposed to be a routine journey to the neighboring settlement. Outside, the February storm had transformed the familiar prairie landscape into an endless sea of white, erasing any trace of the trail that might lead to safety. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. As darkness fell on that third night, Abigail closed her eyes and wondered if anyone would find her before the bitter cold claimed her life. She had no way of knowing that less than 5 miles away, a Lakota scout named Thomas Blackhawk was already tracking her, following nearly invisible signs that no ordinary man could see beneath the endless drifts of snow. What followed would become a tale of survival against impossible odds, a testament to human endurance, cultural understanding, and an unexpected friendship that would change the course of an entire community. Dakota Territory, February 1878. Abigail Thornton had never planned to become a frontier schoolteacher. The daughter of a Boston physician, she had been raised amid the comforts of New England society, educated at a prestigious women's seminary, and groomed for a respectable marriage to a man of similar standing. But when her father's investments collapsed in the financial panic of 1873 and both parents succumbed to influenza the following winter, 22-year-old Abigail found herself alone in the world with little more than her education and determination. Advertisement in the Boston Chronicle had seemed like providence. Educated woman sought to establish schoolhouse in growing settlement, room, board, and modest salary provided. The description painted a picture of a thriving community eager for civilization's refinements. What it failed to mention was that Millbrook was little more than a collection of hastily constructed buildings surrounded by miles of untamed prairie, populated by hardscrabble farmers, former soldiers, and the occasional drifter passing through on the way to somewhere else. "You won't last a month," the stagecoach driver had predicted when he dropped her at Millbrook's only boarding house. Eastern ladies never do. 4 years later, Abigail had not only survived, but flourished. The one-room schoolhouse she had established now educated 27 children, ranging from 5 to 16 years of age. She had adapted to the harsh climate, learned to ride horseback, and earned the respect of even the most skeptical settlers. Though she maintained her proper Boston diction and insistence on correct grammar, she had developed a frontier practicality that served her well in a land where mistakes could prove fatal, which made her current predicament all the more vexing. A journey to Clayton's Ridge should have been straightforward. Superintendent Wallace had requested her presence at a meeting of regional educators, a 2-day affair to discuss curriculum standards and the distribution of the territory's limited educational resources. The settlement lay just 30 miles north of Millbrook, a distance she had covered many times before without incident. "You're certain you don't want an escort, Miss Thornton?" Marshal Jenkins had asked when she mentioned her travel plans at the general store. "Weather's been unpredictable lately. My boy could ride along, see you safely there and back." "That's very kind, Marshal, but unnecessary," Abigail had replied. "The forecast calls for clear skies and I know the route well. Besides, young Daniel can hardly afford to miss 3 days of lessons, particularly given his struggles with arithmetic." Jenkins had nodded reluctantly. "Just be sure to pack extra provisions, miss. Better to have and not need than need and not have." Abigail had followed his advice, loading her sturdy mare with additional blankets, food and ammunition for the small revolver she carried for protection against coyotes and the occasional bandit. She departed at dawn on Monday, expecting to reach Clayton's Ridge by nightfall, attend the two-day meeting, and return to Millbrook by Thursday evening. The first signs of trouble appeared around midday. A sharp wind rose from the northwest, carrying with it a chill that cut through her heavy coat. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, moving with alarming speed toward her position. Abigail urged her horse to a faster pace, hoping to outrun the approaching storm, or at least reach the shelter of Widow Prescott's homestead, which lay roughly halfway between the settlements. She never made it. The storm descended with a ferocity that took her breath away, turning day to night in a matter of minutes. Snow fell in blinding sheets, driven horizontally by winds that threatened to sweep both horse and rider from the trail. Visibility dropped to mere feet, and the temperature plummeted. Disoriented and increasingly desperate, Abigail spotted a dark shape through the swirling white. An abandoned schoolhouse she had heard mentioned by travelers but never seen herself. It stood alone on a small rise, its windows dark and door hanging askew, but it represented her only chance of survival. The interior was dusty but intact. A pot-bellied stove stood in one corner, and a teacher's desk remained at the front of the room, though the student benches had long since been scavenged for firewood. Abigail led her frightened mare inside, grateful for the animal's body heat in the unheated space. Using the last of her matches, she lit the small oil lamp she carried in her saddlebag and took stock of her situation. The blizzard showed no signs of abating. If anything, it seemed to intensify as night fell, the wind finding every crack in the schoolhouse's wooden walls and sending fingers of cold air to probe at her huddled form. Abigail broke apart the teacher's desk and used it to fuel the stove, knowing the wood wouldn't last long, but desperate for any warmth she could generate. By the morning of the third day, Abigail's situation had grown dire. The last of the wood had been consumed, the final scraps of her provisions eaten. Her horse stood motionless in the corner, head drooping from hunger and exhaustion. Outside, the snow had drifted well past the windowsills, effectively sealing. Her inside the small building, she had attempted to maintain a log of her experiences in her small leather-bound journal, partly to pass the time, and partly in the grim recognition that it might serve as her final testament should rescuers eventually find her remains. February 17th, 1878, she wrote in the flickering light of the nearly empty lamp. The cold is becoming unbearable as night approaches. I have burned the last of the wood and consumed the final bit of jerky. The storm continues unabated, though the constant howl of the wind has acquired an almost musical quality. I find myself thinking of home, not Boston, which now seems like a half-remembered dream, but Millbrook with its simple pleasures and honest people. I wonder if they are searching for me. I wonder if they will find me before a sound outside interrupted her writing. Not the wind, but something else, something purposeful. Abigail froze, straining to hear over the storm's constant roar. There it came again, the distinct crunch of footsteps in snow, moving with deliberate purpose toward the schoolhouse door. Her hand moved to the revolver at her side. Rescue seemed unlikely in these conditions. More probable was that some desperate drifter had spotted the faint glow of her lamp and sought shelter, regardless of who might already occupy it. She had heard stories of what happened to lone women in such circumstances. The door shuddered as something heavy pressed against it from the outside. Snow that had sealed the entrance began to fall away as the pressure increased. Abigail cocked the revolver, her Boston-bred propriety giving way to frontier pragmatism. She would not die without a fight. The door burst open in a swirl of snow and frigid air. A figure stood silhouetted against the white backdrop, tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in furs that gave him an almost mythical appearance. For a moment, Neither moved, each assessing the potential threat posed by the other. Then the figure stepped forward, pushing back the fur hood to reveal a man with bronzed skin, high cheekbones, and dark eyes that reflected the lamp's dim light. His black hair was pulled back in a traditional style, though he wore a mixture of native and European clothing, adapted for the harsh conditions. At his hip hung a hunting knife and an army Colt revolver, and a Winchester rifle was slung across his back. "You are alive," he said in careful accented English. "Good. The others thought you would be dead by now." Abigail kept the revolver trained on him, though her hand trembled from cold and exhaustion. "Who are you? How did you find me?" The man made no move toward her, seeming to understand her fear. "I am Thomas Blackhawk, scout for the 7th Cavalry and the Lakota people of Standing Pine Band." He gestured to the storm outside. "When you did not reach Clayton's Ridge, Superintendent, Wallace sent riders to search. But they cannot read the snow as I can. They looked in the wrong places. And you can? Read the snow, I mean." Despite her situation, Abigail's curiosity asserted itself. A faint smile crossed his weathered face. "To those who know how to listen, the prairie speaks, even in winter." He glanced at her mare, then at the burned remnants of the desk, and finally at the nearly empty lamp. "You have survived 3 days. Impressive. But you would not have lasted." The night, the brutal honesty of his assessment, delivered without drama or embellishment, finally convinced Abigail to lower her weapon. "What happens now, Mr. Blackhawk?" Thomas began unpacking a bundle he carried, revealing dried meat, a water skin, and most precious of all, a substantial package of firewood strapped to his back. "Now, Miss Thornton, we survive the night. In the morning, if the storm breaks as I believe it will, we begin the journey to Standing Pine." "How do you know my name?" He paused in his methodical unpacking. "Everyone between here and the Black Hills knows of the Boston lady who teaches frontier children and rides alone between settlements." There was something in his tone. Not quite admiration, but perhaps respect. As Thomas built a fire in the stove and the first blessed waves of warmth began to fill the small schoolhouse, Abigail realized she was in the presence of a man unlike any she had encountered in her 4 years. On the frontier, the unexpected crossing of their paths, a Boston-educated teacher and a Lakota scout, would prove to be merely the first surprising turn in a story neither could have anticipated. The fire in the pot-bellied stove crackled through the night, pushing back the deadly cold that had nearly claimed Abigail's life. Thomas Blackhawk maintained a vigilant watch, adding wood at precise intervals and occasionally stepping outside to assess the storm's progress. Each time he returned, he brought with him a blast of frigid air and a light dusting of snow that melts quickly in the schoolhouse's relative warmth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Abigail drifted in and out of sleep, her body beginning the slow process of recovery now that immediate survival was no longer in question. Whenever she woke, she found Thomas either tending the fire or sitting cross-legged near the door, as still as the wooden figures she had seen in trading posts, his eyes closed, but his posture suggesting complete awareness of his surroundings. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked during one such awakening, her voice hoarse from disuse. Thomas opened his eyes, the firelight reflected in their depths. "When necessary," he replied. "Tonight it is not necessary." "You believe I require a watchman?" "I believe the storm requires one," he corrected. "It is a living thing with moods and intentions. Those who forget this rarely survive a second encounter." The conversation lapsed into silence, but it was a companionable one, devoid of the awkwardness Abigail might have expected given their disparate backgrounds. In fact, she found a curious comfort in his presence, not just the physical security he provided, but something more elemental. Perhaps it was the calm certainty with which he moved through the world, a quality she had strived to emulate during her years on the frontier, but never fully achieved. As dawn approached, the wind's howl diminished to a whisper, and the relentless pounding of snow against the schoolhouse walls ceased altogether. Thomas stepped outside for longer than usual, and when he returned, a faint smile played at the corners of his mouth. "The storm has said what it wished to say," he announced. "We can travel now." Preparations for departure were swift and methodical. Thomas added the last of the firewood to the stove. "For the next traveler who might need shelter," he explained, while Abigail gathered her few belongings. Her mare, revitalized by the night's rest and a portion of dried corn from Thomas's provisions, stood ready by the door. "What about your mount?" Abigail asked, suddenly realizing she had seen no evidence of how he had traveled to the schoolhouse. "I came on foot," he said simply, as if traversing miles of snow-covered prairie during a blizzard were no more remarkable than a stroll through a garden. Abigail's astonishment must have shown on her face, for Thomas continued, "The storm makes tracks impossible for horses, but a man who knows how to move with the wind can go where others cannot." Outside, the world had been transformed. Snow covered everything in a blanket several feet deep, with drifts against the schoolhouse rising nearly to the roofline. The sky above had cleared to a crystalline blue, and the morning sun cast long blue shadows across the pristine white landscape. In the distance, a lone wolf howled, a sound that would have terrified Abigail days earlier, but now seemed merely a part of the tapestry of wilderness surrounding them. Thomas surveyed the terrain with the practiced eye of one who reads landscapes, as others might read books. "Standing Pine lies 17 miles northeast," he said. "With good conditions we could arrive by nightfall. But the snow will slow us, and your horse lacks snowshoes. We will need to stop at Eagle Rock." Eagle Rock? Abigail had never heard of such a place, despite her extensive travels throughout the region. "A place known to my people, not marked on your maps, a hunter's shelter beneath a rock formation." Thomas adjusted the Winchester on his back. "We should move now, while the day is young." The journey proved far more arduous than Thomas's matter-of-fact description had suggested. Though the storm had passed, the temperature remained well below freezing, and the deep snow created natural obstacles that required constant navigation. Abigail's mare struggled through drifts that sometimes reached her chest, while Thomas broke trail ahead, seemingly tireless despite having gone without sleep. They spoke little during the morning hours, conserving energy for the physical demands of travel. Thomas set a careful pace that balanced progress against exhaustion, occasionally stopping to point out landmarks visible only to his trained eye, a cluster of rocks barely visible above the snow, the subtle curve of a frozen creek, the distant silhouette of a hill that looked identical to dozens of others to Abigail. Shortly after midday, they paused in the shelter of a small copse of cottonwoods. Thomas produced pemmican, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries, which Abigail initially regarded with skepticism but found surprisingly palatable given her hunger. "The superintendent's meeting," she said suddenly, the thought occurring to her for the first time since Thomas's arrival. "I've missed it entirely." "Superintendent Wallace will forgive your absence, I think," Thomas replied with dry understatement. "He was among those who believed you dead when you failed to arrive." "And yet you didn't." Thomas regarded her thoughtfully. "I have observed you during your journeys between settlements. You are careful, prepared, not reckless like many who come from eastern cities. When others said you must have perished immediately, I disagreed. The simple assessment warmed Abigail more than the meager winter sun. You've watched me? From where? From wherever I happened to be." There was no self-consciousness in his admission, merely a statement of fact. My duties as scout require me to know who travels through these territories. For the cavalry, a shadow crossed his face. For both sides. I walk between worlds, Miss Thornton. It is a path few choose willingly. Before Abigail could inquire further, Thomas stood and brushed snow from his leggings. We should continue. The light fades early in winter. The afternoon brought new challenges. The temperature began to drop as the sun arced toward the western horizon and the wind picked up, sending plumes of loose snow dancing across the drifts. Abigail's mare tired visibly, each step becoming more labored than the last. Even Thomas's seemingly limitless stamina showed signs of depletion, his breath coming in visible puffs as he forged ahead through particularly deep drifts. Just as Abigail began to fear they would be forced to make camp in the open, vulnerable to the nights. Bitter cold, Thomas gestured toward a rocky outcropping barely visible in the gathering dusk. "Eagle Rock," he announced, relief evident in his usually stoic demeanor. Drawing closer, Abigail saw that what appeared to be a natural formation of boulders had been carefully arranged to create a sheltered space beneath an overhanging ledge. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for her mare to pass through, but opened into a surprisingly spacious interior, protected from the wind on three sides. "It's magnificent," Abigail breathed, dismounting stiffly after hours in the saddle. Thomas looked pleased at her appreciation. "My grandfather helped construct this shelter when he was a young man. Many lives have been saved within these walls." The walls were in fact a combination of stacked stones and carefully positioned timber, with animal hides stretched across gaps to create a windbreak. A stone fire pit occupied the center of the space, surrounded by smooth rocks that could serve as seating. Bundles of dried kindling and firewood were stacked neatly against the rear wall, evidence of the shelter's regular maintenance. "Your people maintain this place for travelers?" Abigail asked as she helped Thomas unsaddle her mare. "For anyone who needs shelter," he corrected. "Lakota, white settler, cavalry soldier. The winter makes no distinction, nor do we offer protection from it." As darkness fell completely, Thomas built a fire with practiced efficiency. The flames cast dancing shadows against the rock walls, creating an almost mystical atmosphere within the shelter. Abigail's mare settled contentedly in a corner with a nosebag of dried corn, while Thomas and Abigail sat near the fire, their faces warmed by its glow. The intimacy of the setting seemed to dissolve some of the natural reserve between them. As they shared another meal of pemmican supplemented by dried berries and a small amount of coffee Thomas had carried in a leather pouch, conversation flowed more freely than it had during their journey. "How did you come to serve as a scout for the cavalry?" Abigail asked, curiosity overcoming her usual reluctance to pry into personal matters. Thomas's expression grew distant, his eyes fixed on the flames. "It was not a choice made lightly. After the Battle of the Greasy Grass, what your people call Little Bighorn, everything changed. The army's vengeance fell heavily upon all Lakota, whether they had fought alongside Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse or not." He paused, seeming to weigh how much to share. "My band, the Standing Pine people, had maintained peaceful relations with white settlers for years. My father was a respected translator who had worked with the Indian agents at Fort Laramie, but suddenly we were all considered hostile." "That's terribly unjust," Abigail said softly. "Justice has little to do with what happens on the frontier. Miss Thornton." There was no bitterness in his tone, merely a weary acceptance. "Captain Montgomery approached my father with an offer. If I would serve as scout for the 7th Cavalry, our band would be permitted to remain on our traditional hunting grounds rather than being forced onto the Great Sioux Reservation." "So you sacrificed your freedom for your people?" Thomas shook his head. "I gained a different kind of freedom. As a scout, I can move between worlds, the white man's and my own. I can ensure that innocent blood is not shed through misunderstanding or fear, and I can protect what remains of our way of life, The fire crackled in the silence that followed, sparks rising toward the stone ceiling. "And you, Miss Thornton," Thomas finally asked, "what brought a Boston physician's daughter to teach on the Dakota frontier?" Abigail smiled ruefully. "Nothing so noble as your motivation, I fear. Necessity, primarily. When my parents died, I found myself with an education but few prospects. The frontier offered opportunities unavailable to women in eastern cities, a chance to build something meaningful rather than merely existing as someone's wife or daughter. You have never considered marriage." The directness of the question might have offended Abigail in another context, but here, in this liminal space between civilization and wilderness, conventional propriety seemed irrelevant. "There have been offers," she admitted. "The widower Carson with his 3 children, young Mr. Hobson from the Mercantile, even Marshall Jenkins hinted at his interest before his late wife's sister arrived from Pennsylvania. Yet you refused. Them all. I value my independence too greatly to surrender it without compelling reason." Abigail warmed her hands by the fire. "Perhaps that makes me peculiar in the eyes of Millbrook society, but I've grown accustomed to their whispers." Thomas nodded slowly. "Among my people, a woman with your strength would be highly respected. Our grandmothers often have the final say in tribal decisions, though the army officers never understand this." The conversation drifted to other topics as the night deepened. Thomas shared stories of his childhood among the Standing Pine people, tales of buffalo hunts and vision quests that seemed to belong to a vanishing world. Abigail, in turn, described Boston's cobblestone streets and grand libraries, the ocean's vastness and the crowded wharves where ships arrived from distant lands. Despite their exhaustion, neither seemed eager to surrender to sleep, as if the unexpected connection forged between them might somehow dissolve in the light of day. When Abigail finally dozed off, wrapped in blankets near the fire, her dreams were filled with unfamiliar symbols and landscapes, as if Thomas's stories had opened a door to a world previously closed to her. She woke to the soft sounds of Thomas preparing for their departure. Dawn light filtered through the entrance to Eagle Rock, illuminating the shelter with a pale glow. Outside, the temperature had plummeted further during the night, but the sky remained clear, a mixed blessing, as Thomas explained. "No new snow means easier travel," he said as they breakfasted on the last of the pemmican, "but a greater cold brings its own dangers." He gestured to her Boston-made boots. "Your feet, do they remain warm?" Abigail wiggled her toes experimentally. "Reasonably so. These boots were specially made for frontier conditions." Thomas looked skeptical, but didn't press the issue. Instead, he outlined their plan for the day, a 9-mile journey to Standing Pine, where they would rest before continuing on to Millbrook the following day. "Standing Pine is not a reservation," he clarified, perhaps sensing Abigail's unspoken questions. "Not yet. It is land that has belonged to my band since before the white man came. The government calls it unallocated territory while they decide whether to honor old treaties." "And will they honor the treaties?" Abigail asked, already suspecting the answer. Thomas's smile held no mirth. "What do you think, Miss Thornton?" They departed Eagle Rock as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered prairie. The second day's travel proved marginally easier than the first. The snow had settled somewhat overnight, providing firmer footing for Abigail's mare. Thomas continued to break trail, moving with a fluid grace that belied the difficulty of the terrain. As midday approached, the landscape began to change subtly. The endless rolling prairie gave way to scattered stands of pine and birch, and in the distance, Abigail could make out the silver ribbon of a frozen river winding through the white expanse. "The Wapiti River," Thomas informed her. "Standing Pine lies just beyond that ridge." He pointed to a modest elevation ahead, distinguished by a cluster of tall pines that stood like sentinels against the blue sky. Will your people welcome a white school teacher? Abigail asked, suddenly anxious about their destination. Thomas glanced back at her, an unreadable expression on his face. They will welcome anyone I bring to them as a guest, but I should warn you, Standing Pine is not what you might expect. Before Abigail could ask what he meant, they created the ridge, and the settlement came into view. What she saw caused her to rein in her mare in surprise. Instead of the traditional encampment of teepees she had anticipated, Standing Pine consisted primarily of sturdy log cabins, arranged in a rough semicircle, with a larger structure at the center that resembled nothing so much as a meeting house. Smoke rose from stone chimneys, and fenced corrals contained horses and cattle. At the edge of the settlement, several traditional teepees stood, their smoke flaps adjusted to the wind's direction. You seem surprised, Thomas observed, a hint of amusement in his voice. I confess I am, Abigail replied honestly. I had expected something more Indian, he suggested when she hesitated. Something less white, Thomas completed her thought. The Standing Pine Band has always been adaptable, Miss Thornton. We take what works from your culture and blend it with our traditions. Does that disappoint you? The question carried an edge that had been absent from their previous exchanges. Not disappointed, Abigail said carefully, merely reminded of my own assumptions. It seems I have as much to learn as my students. Thomas's expression softened. Then perhaps this detour in your journey will prove educational in ways neither of us anticipated. As they approached the settlement, figures emerged from the cabins. First children who pointed excitedly, then adults who moved with more deliberate purpose. A tall, dignified man with grey streaks in his long black hair stepped forward, raising a hand in greeting. Thomas responded with a similar gesture before turning to Abigail with an unexpected formality. Miss Abigail Thornton of Millbrook, and formerly of Boston, he said, welcome to Standing Pine. The man who greeted them at the entrance to Standing Pine was Jacob Blackhawk, Thomas's father and the band's chief negotiator with the U.S. government. Despite his 60 years, he stood straight-backed and vigorous, with penetrating eyes that assessed Abigail with undisguised curiosity. My son rarely brings visitors, he said after Thomas had made introductions. His English was flawless, bearing only the faintest trace of an accent, especially those from the white settlements. Miss Thornton was caught in the blizzard, Thomas explained. She showed remarkable resourcefulness in finding shelter. Jacob's eyebrows rose. The old Chambers schoolhouse? No one has used that place in years. Providence guided me there, Abigail said. Without it and without your son's tracking skills, I would not have survived. A hint of pride flickered across Jacob's weathered features. Thomas learned from the best trackers of our band. Even as a boy, he could follow trails that others could not see. He gestured toward the settlement. Come. You must be exhausted from your journey. As they moved through Standing Pine, Abigail became aware of the curious stares directed her way. Children peered from doorways, and women paused in their tasks to watch the procession. Yet there was no hostility in their gazes, merely the natural interest in an unexpected visitor. The settlement itself continued to surprise her. Gardens lay dormant beneath the snow, their neat rows visible as subtle depressions in the white blanket. A blacksmith's forge stood near what appeared to be a corral for horses. Most striking was the large building at the center of the community, which Thomas identified as their council house. We use it for meetings, ceremonies, and as a schoolhouse, he explained, following her gaze. You have a school? Abigail couldn't hide her surprise. My sister Sarah teaches the children, Jacob said. She was educated at the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania before returning to us. Perhaps you two will find common ground. They arrived at Jacob's cabin, a substantial structure with glass windows, a luxury even in established white settlements. The interior was warm and welcoming, illuminated by both the fire in the stone hearth and oil lamps mounted on the walls. A woman in a blend of traditional and Western clothing rose to greet them, her face bearing a striking resemblance to Thomas's. "My wife, Hannah," Jacob introduced her. "Hannah, this is Miss Thornton, the schoolteacher Thomas rescued from the storm." Hannah's smile was genuine but reserved. "You are welcome here, Miss Thornton. Please sit by the fire while I prepare something warm for you to drink." The domestic scene struck Abigail as both familiar and foreign, the comfortable furnishings and arrangement reminiscent of frontier homes she had visited, yet adorned with items of clearly Lakota origin. Beautifully crafted quill work decorated the mantel, and painted buffalo hides served as rugs upon the wooden floor. Above the hearth hung an aged cavalry sword beside a traditional war club, symbolic of the dual heritage of the household. As Hannah busied herself at the iron stove in the corner, Thomas excused himself to tend to Abigail's mare, leaving her alone with Jacob. The older man settled into a hand-carved chair opposite her, his expression thoughtful. "Thomas tells me you teach at Millbrook," he said, breaking the brief silence. "You must be the woman the settlers call the Boston Lady." "A title I've never particularly embraced," Abigail admitted, "though I suppose there are worse nicknames." "On the frontier," Jacob chuckled. "Indeed, the army officers gave me the name Civilized Indian behind my back. They meant it as praise, though it was really an insult to my people." He gestured to their surroundings. "This way of living, houses instead of teepees, farming alongside hunting, was our choice, not something forced upon us. The Lakota have always adapted to changing circumstances. Yet the government still threatens to relocate your band." Abigail had gathered as much from Thomas's earlier comments. Jacob's expression darkened. "The Treaty of 1868 guaranteed us this land for as long as the grass shall grow and the rivers shall flow. But treaties, it seems, are less permanent than the seasons." He sighed. "Captain Montgomery and his superiors argue that because we have adopted some white ways, we should be willing to move to the reservation. They fail to understand that our connection to this specific land, these rivers, these hills, these burial grounds, cannot be transferred elsewhere." Hannah returned with steaming cups of a fragrant herbal tea, interrupting the increasingly political conversation. "You must be exhausted," she said to Abigail, her manner warming slightly. "After you've had something to eat, I'll show you where you can rest." The meal that followed was simple but hearty: venison stew with wild onions and dried corn, served with bread baked in the iron stove. As they ate, other members of the Blackhawk family arrived, drawn by news of the visitor. Sarah Blackhawk, Thomas's sister and the settlement's teacher, proved to be a woman of intense intelligence and quiet dignity. Educated at the government boarding school but firmly reconnected to her Lakota heritage, she viewed Abigail with professional interest. "How many students do you teach at Millbrook?" she asked as they shared the meal. 27, ranging from 5 to 16 years old," Abigail replied. "And you?" 18, though only during the winter months. When spring comes, the older boys join the hunting parties, and some families still follow the traditional seasonal movements. Sarah leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Do you find it difficult teaching children from such diverse backgrounds? Many of my students speak both Lakota and English, and their understanding of the world comes from two different traditions." The question opened a floodgate of professional exchange. As the meal progressed, Abigail and Sarah delved into the challenges of frontier education: limited resources, irregular attendance, the balance between practical skills and academic knowledge. Jacob and Hannah contributed occasionally, while Thomas remained characteristically quiet, observing the animated discussion with evident approval. It was Hannah who finally insisted that the conversation be continued another time. Miss Thornton has travelled far today, and tomorrow's journey to Millbrook will require strength. Sarah, please show her to the guest quarters. The guest quarters proved to be a small but comfortable room in a cabin adjacent to the main house, normally used by visiting tribal members from other bands. A fire had been lit in advance of her arrival, and fresh bedding laid out on a sturdy wooden frame. Simple though the accommodations were, to Abigail, after 3 days in the abandoned schoolhouse and a night at Eagle Rock, they seemed luxurious. "I've left water for washing," Sarah said, indicating a basin on a side table, "and there are extra blankets in the chest. The nights remain bitter, even with the fire." "Thank you for your hospitality," Abigail said sincerely. "I confess, standing. Pine is not what I expected." Sarah's expression grew thoughtful. "Few white people see beyond their preconceptions of the wild Indian. They romanticize what they do not understand or fear it." She moved toward the door but paused at the threshold. "My brother sees something in you, Miss Thornton. A willingness to look with clear eyes that is rare among your people." Before Abigail could formulate a response to this unexpected observation, Sarah had slipped away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Sleep came quickly, her body still recovering from the ordeal of the storm and the subsequent journey. Her dreams were vivid, images of Boston cobblestones transforming into prairie paths, schoolrooms where her Millbrook students sat alongside Lakota children, and Thomas standing at the boundary between two worlds, beckoning her forward. She woke to the muffled sounds of activity in the settlement, voices calling, horses nickering, the rhythmic chunk of an axe splitting wood. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, suggesting she had slept later than her usual dawn rising. Hastily washing and dressing, Abigail emerged to find Standing Pine fully awake and engaged in daily routines that seemed both foreign and familiar. Women worked at tanning hides and mending clothing, their techniques different from those Abigail had observed in white settlements, but their purpose identical. Children darted between cabins, their games and laughter a universal language. Men returned from early hunting expeditions or tended to livestock in the corrals. The scene struck Abigail as neither savage nor civilized, merely human, adapted to the particular circumstances of this place and people. She found Thomas at the edge of the settlement, conferring with 2 younger men beside a sled constructed of wood and bone runners. Her mare stood nearby, looking surprisingly refreshed after their arduous journey. "Good morning, Miss Thornton," Thomas greeted her with a nod. "I trust you slept well?" "Better than I have in days," she admitted. "Your people have been most hospitable. They are curious about you. Few white women venture this far from established settlements, especially school teachers." He gestured to the sled. "The trail to Millbrook remains difficult for horses. We'll use this to distribute the weight more evenly." The practicality of the solution impressed her. "You've clearly given this considerable thought. I prefer to anticipate problems rather than confront them unprepared." Thomas turned to the younger men and spoke briefly in Lakota, eliciting nods of understanding before they departed with the sled. "We should eat before departing. My mother has prepared food." In the daylight, Hannah Blackhawk proved more forthcoming than she had been the previous evening. As they shared a breakfast of corn cakes and dried berries, she engaged Abigail in conversation about her life in Millbrook, asking detailed questions about her teaching methods and living arrangements. "You live alone?" Hannah seemed particularly surprised by this detail. "Without family?" "The community serves as my family in many ways," Abigail explained. "Mrs. Wilson at the boarding house keeps an eye on my welfare, and the parents of my students include me in their gatherings." Hannah shook her head slightly. "Still, a woman should have people who are truly hers, by blood or by marriage. It provides protection in difficult times. I've managed thus far on my own," Abigail said, trying to keep defensiveness from her tone. At what cost? Hannah's directness was startling. Forgive me, but I see the weariness behind your eyes, Miss Thornton. It is the look of someone who carries all burdens alone. Before Abigail could formulate a reply to this uncomfortably perceptive observation, Jacob and Thomas entered, bringing with them a blast of cold air and news that preparations for departure were complete. The temperature has risen slightly, Jacob reported. Good conditions for travel, though you should still expect difficulties along the way. Will you accompany us? Abigail asked, surprised to find herself hoping for a negative answer. The prospect of another day alone with Thomas held an appeal she wasn't entirely prepared to examine. Jacob shook his head. My responsibilities keep me here, but Thomas knows the way better than anyone. You'll be safely delivered to Millbrook before nightfall. Farewells were brief but warm. Sarah extracted a promise from Abigail to correspond about educational matters, while Hannah pressed a small package of food upon her for the journey. Jacob's parting words, however, lingered longest in her mind. You are welcome at Standing Pine at any time, Miss Thornton, he said, clasping her hand in both of his. Those who can see beyond the boundaries others create are rare in these territories. The sled proved to be an ingenious solution to the challenges of winter travel. Constructed of flexible wood with runners made from polished bone, it distributed the weight of their supplies evenly across the snow's surface. Abigail's mare pulled it with considerably less strain than she would have experienced carrying saddlebags through the deep drifts. Thomas set a steady pace as they left Standing Pine behind, following what appeared to be an invisible trail through the snow-covered landscape. The day was clear but cold, the sun providing light without significant warmth. Their breath formed clouds of vapor that lingered briefly before dissipating in the winter air. Your family is remarkable, Abigail said, as they crested a rise that provided the last view of the settlement before it disappeared behind them. Thomas glanced at her, gauging her sincerity. They have survived much. Your father spoke of the government's threats to relocate your band. Is the situation truly so precarious? A shadow crossed Thomas's features. More precarious than he admits, even to himself. Captain Montgomery has already drafted orders for our voluntary relocation to the Great Sioux Reservation. Only bureaucratic delays in Washington have prevented their implementation. But that's unconscionable. Your people have clearly established a permanent settlement, adopting agricultural practices alongside traditional ways. Surely that's what the Indian agents claim to want? Thomas's laugh held no humor. What they claim to want and what they actually desire are rarely the same thing, Miss Thornton. The truth is simpler. Our land has been surveyed and found to contain coal deposits. Suddenly, the treaty guaranteeing it to us has become inconvenient. The injustice of the situation struck Abigail forcefully. There must be something that can be done. Perhaps if influential people in the territorial government were made aware. They are aware, Thomas interrupted gently. Some even express private sympathy. But coal means railroads, and railroads mean progress. And progress, it seems, always moves in one direction, regardless of who or what stands in its path. They traveled in silence for a time, each absorbed in their own thoughts. The landscape gradually shifted from the mixed forests surrounding Standing Pine to the open prairie that characterized much of the Dakota Territory. By midday, they had covered nearly half the distance to Millbrook, making better time than either had anticipated. They paused to rest the mare and share the food Hannah had provided, dried meat, corn cakes, and a type of pemmican mixed with berries that Abigail found surprisingly palatable. Seated on a fallen log cleared of snow, they ate without speaking, the vast silence of the winter prairie enveloping them in a curious intimacy. "May I ask you something, Miss Thornton?" Thomas finally broke the silence, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. "Of course. Why do you remain in Millbrook? You've mentioned that other positions have been offered to you in more established settlements. Yet you stay in a place that must seem primitive compared to your Boston upbringing." The question caught Abigail off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because she had rarely articulated her reasons, even to herself. "I suppose because I'm needed there," she began slowly. "When I arrived, the children had no formal education beyond what their parents could provide. Many couldn't read. Some had never held a book. Now," she smiled at the memory of recent achievements, "now Mary Carson is corresponding with a girl in New York City. Timothy Reynolds can calculate complex agricultural yields in his head. Elizabeth Woods writes poetry that would impress Boston critics. You've built something meaningful," Thomas observed. "I've tried to, but it's more than that." Abigail searched for words to express the ineffable connection she felt to the frontier community. "In Boston, I was always someone's daughter, someone's potential wife, someone's social obligation. In Millbrook, I am simply myself, judged by what I contribute rather than by my connections or prospects." Thomas nodded slowly. "Freedom of a kind." "Yes, precisely. Freedom to define myself by my own actions rather than by others' expectations." She hesitated, then added, "Not unlike the freedom you described finding in your role as scout." A look of surprise crossed Thomas's face, quickly replaced by thoughtful consideration. "Perhaps we are not so different in that regard, Miss Thornton." The moment stretched between them, charged with an unspoken recognition of shared understanding despite their vastly different backgrounds. In those few seconds, Abigail felt the boundaries she had carefully maintained between teacher and woman, between professional and personal, begin to blur in ways both exhilarating and terrifying. It was Thomas who finally broke the tension, rising to his feet with a practiced grace that belied the hours of travel. "We should continue if we hope to reach Millbrook before dark." The remainder of their journey passed with increasing signs of proximity to white settlement. They crossed fence lines marking homesteaders' claims, past isolated cabins with smoke rising from stone chimneys, and eventually joined a more established trail bearing the marks of recent wagon traffic. As the winter sun began its early descent toward the western horizon, the scattered buildings of Millbrook appeared in the distance, the steeple of its small church rising above the general store, boarding house, and assorted dwellings that constituted the frontier community. Even from afar, Abigail could see unusual activity in the main street, figures moving with purpose rather than the languid pace typical of winter afternoons. "Something's happening," Thomas observed, his scout's instincts alert to the abnormal patterns. "Perhaps news of another storm?" Abigail suggested, though the clear sky believed such concerns. As they drew closer, individual figures became recognizable. Marshal Jenkins stood before the general store, gesturing emphatically to a cluster of men. Mrs. Wilson, from the boarding house, paced the porch, periodically shading her eyes to scan the horizon. Most surprising was the presence of Superintendent Wallace himself, immediately identifiable by his formal Eastern attire, so out of place amid the practical frontier garb of Millbrook's residents. It was young Daniel Jenkins who spotted them. First, his high-pitched voice carrying clearly across the distance, "It's Miss Thornton! She's alive!" The cry galvanized the assembled townspeople, who turned as one in their direction. For a moment, they seemed frozen in collective disbelief. Then, like a dam breaking, they surged forward, voices raised in exclamations of shock and joy. Abigail glanced at Thomas, suddenly aware of how his presence might be received by the settlement. "They may not understand. They will understand that you have returned safely," he interrupted calmly. "The rest can be explained in due course." As the first townspeople reached them, their expressions shifting from disbelief to relief to curiosity at her companion, Abigail realized that her return to Millbrook marked not the end of an ordeal, but the beginning of a more complex journey. One that might well bridge the carefully separated worlds that Thomas Blackhawk navigated with such hard-won grace. The reception in Millbrook unfolded like a scene from a theatrical production, full of dramatic exclamations, tearful embraces, and the constant overlapping of voices as townspeople pressed forward to greet Abigail and gawk at her companion. Mrs. Wilson from the boarding house reached her first, enveloping her in a fierce hug that belied her usual reserved demeanor. "We thought you lost to the storm," the older woman declared, her voice breaking. "After 3 days with no word, even the search parties abandoned hope." Marshal Jenkins approached more cautiously, his weathered face a mixture of relief and lingering concern as his gaze shifted between Abigail and Thomas. "Miss Thornton, thank the Lord you're safe." He extended a hand toward Thomas with evident hesitation. "And you are?" "Thomas Blackhawk," came the level response. "Scout for the 7th Cavalry." The military affiliation visibly relaxed Jenkins's posture, though wariness remained in his eyes. "You found her, then?" "At the old Chambers schoolhouse," Thomas confirmed. "She had taken shelter there during the storm's height, a wise decision that saved her life." Superintendent Wallace pushed through the growing crowd, his city clothes looking rumpled and travel-worn. "Miss Thornton, this is extraordinary." His gaze, like Jenkins's, moved assessingly to Thomas. "And fortuitous timing. We were about to dispatch a formal letter to your next of kin in Boston." The thought of distant relatives receiving news of her death sent a chill through Abigail that had nothing to do with the winter temperature. "As you can see, such correspondence would have been premature." "Indeed." Wallace's jovial tone seemed forced. "And we have this gentleman to thank for your safe return." Before Abigail could respond, young Timothy Reynolds, one of her brightest students, burst forward. "Is he really a Lakota scout? Did he track you through the blizzard? How did he find you when nobody else could?" The boy's eager questions, free from the adult's carefully masked suspicion, brought a smile to Abigail's face. "Yes to all your questions, Timothy. Mr. Blackhawk possesses tracking skills that bordered on miraculous to my eyes. Without him, I would not be standing here now." Her unequivocal acknowledgement of Thomas's role seemed to shift something in the crowd's collective demeanor. Suspicious glances gave way to curious ones, and several of the men nodded with grudging respect. "Well then," Marshal Jenkins declared, stepping forward to offer Thomas a more confident handshake, "Millbrook owes you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Blackhawk." Thomas accepted the gesture with characteristic reserve. "Miss Thornton saved herself by finding shelter. I merely helped her complete the journey home." "Nevertheless," Superintendent Wallace interjected, "such assistance deserves recognition. Perhaps you'll join us at the boarding house for a meal before you depart. Mrs. Wilson always prepares more than enough." The invitation was clearly unexpected, both to Thomas and to many of the townspeople whose expressions registered varying degrees of surprise. In the 4 years since Abigail had arrived in Millbrook, she could not recall a single instance of a Native American being invited to dine at the boarding house, regardless of their status or affiliation. Thomas hesitated, his gaze meeting Abigail's briefly before he responded. "Thank you, but I should return to Fort Laramie to report Miss Thornton's safe recovery. Captain Montgomery will be expecting me." Surely the captain would understand a slight delay, Abigail found herself saying, surprising even herself with the urgency in her tone. "The hour grows late for travel, and you've already journeyed far today." A flicker of something, amusement, appreciation, crossed Thomas's usually stoic features. "The Army has its protocols, Miss Thornton. As does basic hospitality," she countered. "You've ensured my safe return to Millbrook. The least we can offer is a meal and proper rest before you depart." Mrs. Wilson, who had been observing this exchange with uncharacteristic silence, suddenly stepped forward. "Miss Thornton is right. No one leaves my boarding house hungry, especially not someone who's brought one of our own back safely." Her tone brooked no argument, reminding Abigail why the widow had successfully managed the establishment for 15 years, despite the frontier's challenges. Thomas recognized the same immovable force in the older woman's demeanor. With a slight inclination of his head that somehow conveyed both acceptance and amusement, he acquiesced. "I would be honored, Mrs. Wilson." The crowd began to disperse as Millbrook absorbed the novelty of Abigail's return and the more controversial presence of her rescuer. Jenkins dispatched his son to care for Abigail's mare and the ingenious sled that had transported their supplies. Superintendent Wallace, after extracting a promise from Abigail to provide a full account of her ordeal at her earliest convenience, departed for Clayton's Ridge with undisguised relief at having one less crisis to manage. The boarding house dining room had never felt quite so tense in Abigail's experience. The long oak table that normally hosted convivial conversation among the establishment's residents now seemed divided into invisible territories. At one end sat the regular boarders, Mr. Peterson the blacksmith, the widow gardener who ran the millinery shop, and young Dr. Holcomb, who had arrived just 6 months earlier from Philadelphia. At the opposite end sat Abigail and Thomas, with Mrs. Wilson serving as a neutral buffer between the factions as she bustled about with uncharacteristic energy. Conversation proceeded in awkward fits and starts. The usual topics: weather predictions, livestock prices, news from Eastern newspapers, seemed suddenly inadequate. Every attempt at normalcy was undermined by surreptitious glances toward Thomas, who ate with quiet dignity, appearing neither discomfited by the scrutiny nor eager to engage beyond basic courtesy. It was Dr. Holcomb who finally broke the strained atmosphere. "Mr. Blackhawk," he began, setting down his fork with deliberate care, "I understand you serve as a scout for the 7th Cavalry. May I ask how you came to that position?" The directness of the question caused Mrs. Wilson to pause mid-pour of the coffee, her expression suggesting the young doctor had breached some unspoken protocol. But Thomas merely nodded, accepting the query as legitimate interest rather than impertinence. My father served as translator at Fort Laramie during the early treaty negotiations," he explained. "When relations between the Army and the Lakota deteriorated after the Black Hills Gold Rush, Captain Montgomery recognized the value of scouts who understood both cultures. I was recommended based on my tracking abilities." "Fascinating," Dr. Holcomb replied with genuine interest. "And you're able to move between military service and your traditional community without conflict." A shadow passed across Thomas's features, so briefly that only Abigail, watching him closely, seemed to notice. "Every bridge between worlds experiences tension from both sides, Dr. Holcomb. The question is whether the connection provides enough value to justify that tension." The philosophical turn in his response seemed to surprise the young doctor, who leaned forward with increased interest. "And does it provide enough value, on some days more than others?" Thomas's gaze moved briefly to Abigail before returning to the doctor. "Today, I would say yes." The simple statement carried implications that sent a flush of warmth to Abigail's cheeks. Mrs. Wilson, with her uncanny ability to detect emotional undercurrents, swooped in with a fresh pot of coffee and a change of subject. "Miss Thornton, you must be exhausted from your ordeal. Perhaps you'd like to retire early. I've prepared your old room, kept it ready these past days, hoping against hope." The offer was tempting. Abigail's body ached from the days of travel, and the emotional strain of returning to Millbrook under such dramatic circumstances had depleted her reserves. Yet she found herself reluctant to end the evening, aware that Thomas would likely depart at first light. "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson, but I believe I'll stay a while longer. Mr. Blackhawk and I have hardly had a chance to properly express my gratitude for his assistance." Mrs. Wilson's knowing glance suggested she understood more than Abigail might wish, but she merely nodded. "As you prefer, dear. The parlor fire is freshly stoked should you desire more private conversation." The subtle encouragement was not lost on either Abigail or Thomas. When the meal concluded, they found themselves naturally gravitating toward the small parlor adjacent to the dining room. The space, with its mismatched furniture collected over years of frontier improvisation, had never seemed particularly intimate to Abigail before. Now seated across from Thomas in the golden glow of the fire and oil lamps, she was acutely aware of the room's cozy dimensions. "Your community seems relieved by your return," Thomas observed, breaking the momentary silence. "They are kind people." "For the most part," Abigail replied, "though I suspect their reception might have been different had I arrived alone with a Lakota man not affiliated with the cavalry." Thomas's expression remained impassive, but his eyes reflected understanding of the unspoken social complexities. "The uniform opens doors that would otherwise remain closed. It is one reason I maintain my position despite complications." "The situation with Standing Pine that your father mentioned," he nodded. "Among other things, the 7th Cavalry carries the shadow of Little Bighorn in its memory. Some officers view all Lakota with suspicion, regardless of past alliances. Yet Captain Montgomery seems to value your services." Montgomery is a practical man. He recognizes that preventing conflict serves the Army's interests as much as winning battles. Thomas gazed into the fire, its light illuminating the sharp planes of his face. "But he has superiors with different priorities, and those priorities increasingly point toward removal of all Lakota from traditional lands, even bands like Standing Pine that have maintained peaceful relations." The injustice stirred Abigail's sense of moral outrage. There must be something that can be done, perhaps if influential settlers advocated on behalf of Standing Pine. Thomas's gentle laugh interrupted her. "Always the teacher, Miss Thornton, believing education can solve all problems." There was no mockery in his tone, merely a rueful acknowledgement of her idealism. "The forces driving these decisions originate far from Dakota territory, in Washington offices, where maps show resources, but not people." "Then the advocacy must reach Washington as well," Abigail insisted. "Superintendent Wallace has connections in the territorial government. And there are sympathetic journalists in eastern cities who might—" "Miss Thornton." Thomas leaned forward, his expression more earnest than she had yet witnessed. "Your concern honors you, but this is not your burden to carry. You have your students, your community. Standing Pine has survived challenges before." "As have you," she observed quietly. "But survival alone seems an insufficient aspiration when justice is at stake." Something shifted in Thomas's gaze, a recognition, perhaps, that she would not be easily dissuaded from involvement. Before he could respond, however, the parlor door opened to admit Mrs. Wilson, carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. "I thought you might appreciate a nightcap before retiring," the older woman announced, placing the tray on the small table between them. Her assessing glance moved from Abigail to Thomas and back again. "Mr. Blackhawk, I've prepared the small room at the end of the hall for you. It's modest but clean." Thomas appeared momentarily surprised by the arrangement. "That's very generous, Mrs. Wilson, but I had planned to depart at first light." "Nonsense. The temperature has dropped considerably since sunset, and that mare of Miss Thornton's needs proper rest before another journey." Mrs. Wilson's tone made clear that she considered the matter settled. "Besides, the children will be heartbroken if they don't get a chance to meet the man who rescued their teacher. They've been dismissed from classes these past days in mourning. They deserve the happier ending to the story." The mention of her students brought a pang of emotion to Abigail's chest. In the drama of her return, she had scarcely considered the impact her presumed death might have had on the children she taught. "Are they truly all right, Mrs. Wilson?" The older woman's expression softened. "They're resilient, as children tend to be, but they'll be much improved by seeing you tomorrow." She moved toward the door, but paused at the threshold. "Don't stay up too late, either of you. I suspect tomorrow will bring no shortage of excitement to Millbrook." After Mrs. Wilson's departure, a comfortable silence settled between them. Thomas sipped his tea thoughtfully, while Abigail found herself studying him with a new perspective. In the civilized setting of the parlor, away from the harsh demands of survival in the wilderness, she was struck by the duality he embodied. The Lakota scout and the man at ease in a frontier boarding house, navigating both worlds with a grace that seemed hard-won. "You're staring, Miss Thornton," he observed without looking up from his cup. Abigail felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Forgive me. I was just reflecting on how differently this week might have ended without your intervention." "You would have found another way to survive," Thomas said with unexpected certainty. "I recognized that quality in you long before the storm. It's why I disagreed when the search parties declared you lost." "You've observed me before," Abigail recalled his earlier admission, "during my travels between settlements." Thomas nodded, unembarrassed by the acknowledgement. "My duties as scout require awareness of all who move through these territories. But yes, I noted your self-sufficiency. Unlike many who come from eastern cities, you adapted to frontier life rather than expecting it to adapt to you." The assessment pleased her more than it probably should have. "Necessity is an effective teacher." "As are you, from what I've gathered." Thomas set his cup down with deliberate care. "Your students speak of you with admiration when they encounter patrols, even the older boys, who might typically dismiss a woman's authority. You've spoken with my students." Abigail couldn't hide her surprise. Children are often less guarded around those they perceive as different. They ask questions adults would consider impolite. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Young Timothy Reynolds was particularly curious about Lakota hunting techniques last spring when his father's party encountered our patrol." The thought of Thomas interacting with her students, observing her influence on them from afar while she remained unaware of his existence, created an odd sensation in Abigail's chest. How many other connections existed between their separate worlds that she had never recognized? "Will you truly stay until tomorrow?" she asked, changing the subject to more immediate concerns. "Mrs. Wilson seems disinclined to accept refusal," Thomas replied with dry humor, "and there is wisdom in allowing your mare full recovery before the journey to Fort Laramie. The children would indeed be disappointed to miss meeting you," Abigail added. "They've devoured every book on frontier exploration and native cultures I've been able to procure for our small library. To meet someone who embodies both traditions would be an invaluable educational experience." Thomas studied her with quiet amusement. "Always the teacher. It's who I am," she acknowledged simply. "Yes," he agreed, his expression warming. "It is." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 10, startling both of them with the reminder of the hour's advance. Abigail rose reluctantly, aware that propriety demanded an end to their private conversation, despite her desire to continue it. "I should retire," she said. "The past days have been demanding." Thomas stood as well, the movement fluid despite his evident fatigue. "Rest well, Miss Thornton." "Abigail," she corrected impulsively, "after sharing such an ordeal, it seems unnecessary to maintain formalities, at least in private conversation." The surprise that flickered across his features was quickly replaced by something warmer. "Then you must call me Thomas rather than Mr. Blackhawk." "Thomas," she repeated, testing the intimacy of the address. "Good night. And thank you, not just for the rescue, but for..." everything that followed. He understood her meaning without further elaboration. "Sleep well, Abigail." As she climbed the familiar stairs to her room at the boarding house, Abigail was struck by the strange sensation that despite returning to Millbrook, to the community and role she had established over 4 years, she was somehow entering new territory, as unmapped and full of potential as the Dakota wilderness itself. Morning arrived with the crisp clarity that often followed the passage of a major storm. Abigail woke to sunshine streaming through her window and the comforting sounds of Millbrook beginning its day. Wagon wheels on packed snow, merchants opening shops, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. For a moment, the events of the past days seemed dreamlike in their improbability. Then the soreness in her muscles and the raw patches on her hands provided tangible reminders of their reality. Dressing with particular care in her best blue wool dress, recently mended but still the most presentable option in her limited wardrobe, Abigail descended to the boarding house dining room with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Would Thomas have departed despite Mrs. Wilson's insistence on hospitality? And if he remained, how would their connection, forged in the isolation of survival and deepened in last night's private conversation, translate to the public scrutiny of daylight? She need not have worried on the first count. Thomas sat at the dining room table in conversation with Dr. Holcomb, who leaned forward with the intense interest of a man encountering perspectives far outside his previous experience. Mrs. Wilson bustled between kitchen and dining room, looking pleased with herself as she deposited a platter of flapjacks at the center of the table. "Ah, Miss Thornton!" she exclaimed upon noticing Abigail's arrival. "Just in time for a proper breakfast. You must be famished after subsisting on trail rations these past days." Thomas rose at Abigail's entrance, a courtesy she suspected came more from his cavalry interactions than Lakota tradition. "Good morning, Miss Thornton," he greeted her, the formal address a reminder of their public setting, despite the private agreement of the previous evening. "Mr. Blackhawk," she replied in kind, taking the seat Mrs. Wilson indicated, coincidentally, or perhaps not adjacent to Thomas. "I'm pleased to see you remained for breakfast. Mrs. Wilson can be quite persuasive," he said, with a hint of humor that only Abigail seemed to catch. Dr. Holcomb, eager to resume their interrupted conversation, leaned across the table. Mr. Blackhawk was just explaining the traditional hunting territories of the various Lakota bands, fascinating system of mutual respect and seasonal rotation that maximized the land's productivity without depleting resources. Quite ingenious, really. Indeed, Abigail agreed, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Wilson with murmured thanks. Indigenous knowledge of the land often surpasses our own, though we're reluctant to acknowledge as much. The doctor's eyebrows rose at her frank assessment. "Rather progressive view, Miss Thornton." "Merely a practical one," she countered. "My survival this past week stands as testament to the value of such knowledge." Before the conversation could deepen further, the boarding house door burst open to admit a whirlwind of excited children, led by Timothy Reynolds and followed by a harried-looking Marshal Jenkins. "Sorry for the intrusion, Mrs. Wilson," Jenkins apologized. Word spread that Miss Thornton had returned, and the children insisted on seeing her before formal classes resumed. I couldn't hold them back any longer. The children, at least a dozen of Abigail's students ranging from 6 to 16, crowded into the dining room, their faces alight with joy and relief at the sight of their teacher. Young Elizabeth Woods burst into tears, while Timothy and several older boys attempted to maintain dignified composure despite the suspicious moisture in their eyes. "Miss Thornton!" they exclaimed in near unison. "You're really alive!" For the First time since her return to Millbrook, Abigail felt the full emotional impact of what might have been lost. Not just her life, but these connections, these young minds she had helped shape. Tears sprang to her eyes as she rose to embrace Elizabeth, then found herself surrounded by children, all speaking at once, their questions and exclamations overlapping in excited chaos. Were you scared? Did you really survive alone in an abandoned schoolhouse? We thought you were dead. Did wolves try to get in? Is that the Indian scout who found you? The last question, from observant Timothy, directed the children's collective attention to Thomas, who had risen at their entrance but now stood slightly apart, watching the reunion with an unreadable expression. Yes, Abigail confirmed, wiping away tears as she attempted to regain her composure. This is Mr. Thomas Blackhawk, scout for the 7th Cavalry and member of the Standing Pine Band of the Lakota. Without his exceptional tracking skills, I might never have returned to you. The children regarded Thomas with undisguised fascination, not the guarded wariness of the adults, but the open curiosity of young minds encountering something new and potentially exciting. Timothy, always the boldest, stepped forward with hand extended in imitation of adult greeting. "Thank you for finding Miss Thornton, sir. She's the best teacher Millbrook's ever had." Thomas accepted the handshake with appropriate seriousness. "You're welcome, Timothy Reynolds. Miss Thornton spoke highly of her students during our journey. I can see her pride is well placed." The simple acknowledgement transformed the children's interest into outright admiration. They pressed forward with a barrage of questions about tracking, survival in blizzards, and Lakota traditions. To Abigail's surprise and pleasure, Thomas answered with patient detail, his usually reserved demeanor softening as he engaged with their genuine curiosity. As she watched him explain to Elizabeth the principles of reading weather signs, and to Timothy the construction of the bone runners on the sled that had transported their supplies, Abigail felt a profound shift in her perception, not just of Thomas, but of the possibilities that might exist beyond the carefully maintained boundaries between their separate worlds. Marshal Jenkins, observing the impromptu educational session, with grudging appreciation, leaned toward Abigail. "Superintendent Wallace left a message before departing. He's requested your presence in Clayton's Ridge next week to provide a formal account of your experience." "Of course," Abigail agreed. Absently, her attention still focused on Thomas and the children. He also mentioned that Captain Montgomery will be attending the territorial education meeting. Jenkins lowered his voice. "There's talk of expanding educational initiatives to include Indian children from peaceful bands. Your connection with Mr. Blackhawk might prove relevant to those discussions." The statement pulled Abigail's focus fully to the marshal. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Jenkins?" The man shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. "Only experiences like yours, bridging different worlds during a crisis, might inform policy in constructive ways. If you were willing to advocate based on what you've learned." Abigail glanced back at Thomas, now demonstrating to the enthralled children how to identify cardinal directions without a compass. The seed of an idea began to form in her mind. Not just advocacy for Standing Pine's land rights, but something broader, something that might create lasting connections between communities too long separated by prejudice and misunderstanding. "He may indeed have perspectives to share at the meeting," she said carefully, "though I suspect the journey ahead involves more than a simple trip to Clayton's Ridge." Jenkins followed her gaze to Thomas and the children, his expression thoughtful. "Some journeys change more than just our location, Miss Thornton." On this point, at least, Abigail found she could wholeheartedly agree. The week following Abigail's return to Millbrook passed in a blur of resumed routines and subtle transformations. Outwardly, life quickly settled back into familiar patterns. She reopened the schoolhouse, resumed lessons, and reclaimed her place in the community with a minimum of fuss. The frontier, with its constant demands and challenges, allowed little time for dwelling on what might have been. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy, Abigail sensed shifts in both herself and her relationship to Millbrook. Experiences once taken for granted now carried new significance. The solid security of the schoolhouse walls, the eager faces of her students each morning, even the simple luxury of hot coffee by a well-tended fire. All these registered with heightened appreciation after her brush with mortality. More surprising were the subtle changes in how the community regarded her. She had always been respected as the schoolteacher, valued for her contribution to Millbrook's development. Now, however, she detected a deeper regard in greetings from townspeople who had previously been merely cordial. Having survived what many considered certain death, she had unexpectedly joined the ranks of the frontier's resilient elite, those whose mettle had been tested by the territory's harshest realities and found sufficient. Thomas Blackhawk had departed Millbrook the day after their arrival, his military duties requiring his return to Fort Laramie. The farewell had been characteristically restrained, a brief exchange on the boarding house porch as dawn painted the snow-covered street in shades of gold and rose. Safe travels, Abigail had offered, aware of the inadequacy of conventional, imparting words for the bond forged between them. "And you," Thomas replied, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that conveyed more than his measured words. "Until our paths cross again, Miss Thornton." "Abigail," she had reminded him quietly, mindful of Mrs. Wilson watching discreetly from the window. A rare smile had transformed his usually stoic features. "Abigail," he acknowledged, "remember what I said about Standing Pine. You are welcome there, should circumstances bring you that way again." The invitation had lingered in her thoughts throughout the week, as had Marshal Jenkins's cryptic comment about the upcoming meeting in Clayton's Ridge. The Territorial Education Conference, initially a routine administrative gathering, now seemed charged with unexpected potential following. Jenkins's hint about expanding educational initiatives to include Native children, Abigail found herself revisiting her conversations with Sarah Blackhawk about teaching methods for children straddling two cultures. What had begun as a professional exchange between educators now struck her as potentially significant to larger policy questions. The territorial government's approach to education had always focused on assimilation rather than integration. Native children sent to distant boarding schools to unlearn their heritage rather than building upon the strengths of both traditions. Could her experience, bridging different worlds during crisis, as Jenkins had put it, offer an alternative perspective? The question both intrigued and intimidated her. Boston-bred propriety cautioned against inserting herself into political matters beyond her station, while frontier pragmatism recognized opportunities that might not come again. These thoughts occupied her mind as she prepared for the journey to Clayton's Ridge, packing more carefully than she had before her ill-fated previous attempt. Marshal Jenkins, making good on his earlier offer of escort, had arranged for his eldest son to accompany her, a precaution she accepted without the previous resistance, her recent experience having tempered confidence with prudence. The night before her departure, Mrs. Wilson invited her to a private tea in the boarding house parlor after the other residents had retired. The older woman had maintained a thoughtful distance during Abigail's recovery, offering practical support without pressing for confidence. Now, as they settled before the fire with steaming cups, Mrs. Wilson's expression suggested the time for discretion had passed. "You seem preoccupied, dear," she observed, adding a generous spoonful of honey to her tea, "apprehensive about returning." "To the scene of your misadventure?" Abigail smiled at the gentle probe. "Not apprehensive precisely. The journey itself holds no particular terror after what I've experienced. It's the meeting in Clayton's Ridge that occupies my thoughts." Ah, Superintendent Wallace's educational conference. Mrs. Wilson stirred her tea with deliberate care. I understand Captain Montgomery will be attending as well. The comment was delivered casually, but Abigail caught its significance immediately. News travels quickly in Millbrook. Small communities thrive on information, Mrs. Wilson acknowledged without apology, particularly when it involves military officers, territorial policy, and the potential implications for local settlements. And what else does Millbrook's information network report about the meeting? The older woman's gaze was shrewd. That discussion will include the question of educational provisions for certain Lakota bands not currently confined to reservations, Standing Pine among them. Abigail couldn't hide her surprise at the specificity of the intelligence. How did you— My late husband served as quartermaster at Fort Laramie for 15 years, Mrs. Wilson interrupted calmly. I maintain correspondence with former colleagues who keep me apprised of developments that might affect the territory's stability. The education question is considered less volatile than land allocations, but potentially influential in longer-term relations. The revelation of Mrs. Wilson's connections and her evident interest in territorial politics cast the boarding house proprietress in an entirely new light. Why are you sharing this with me now? Mrs. Wilson set her cup down with deliberate care. Because you stand at a crossroads, Miss Thornton, whether you recognize it or not. Your experience with Mr. Blackhawk and your visit to Standing Pine place you in a unique position to influence discussions that may determine the future of communities on both sides of the cultural divide. Surely you overestimate my potential. Influence, Abigail protested. I'm merely a schoolteacher summoned to provide an account of my misadventure. There is nothing mere about your position, Mrs. Wilson countered firmly. Education has always been the frontier upon which cultural battles are ultimately decided. Those who shape young minds determine the character of the society. Those minds will eventually govern. The assertion startled Abigail with its philosophical scope, so unexpected from the practical boarding house manager. You sound like you've given this considerable thought. I've had 25 years on the frontier to observe the patterns of conflict and cooperation between different peoples, Mrs. Wilson replied. Violence and treaties capture historical attention, but the true transformation happens in schoolrooms and around dinner tables, where perspectives are shaped without fanfare. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. Tell me honestly, Miss Thornton, did your view of the Lakota people change during your time with Mr. Blackhawk and at Standing Pine? Of course, Abigail admitted without hesitation. How could it not? Books and newspaper accounts provide only the barest sketches, usually colored by the reporter's preconceptions. Actually experiencing their community, speaking with educators like Sarah Blackhawk, seeing the complexity of their adaptation to changing circumstances, it transformed abstract knowledge into lived understanding. Precisely. Mrs. Wilson settled back, satisfaction evident in her posture. Now imagine if that opportunity for transformed understanding were available to children on both sides of the divide before prejudices calcify into certainties. The vision was compelling, resonating with Abigail's deepest instincts as an educator, yet practical obstacles loomed large in her mind. The territorial government has shown little interest in innovative approaches to Native education. Their policy has consistently focused on assimilation rather than exchange. Policies change when practical success offers a more attractive alternative than theoretical rigidity, Mrs. Wilson observed. Captain Montgomery is a pragmatist above all else. He recognizes that peaceful relations with bands like Standing Pine serve military interests better than costly conflicts. If educational initiatives support that pragmatic goal, She left the implication hanging in the air between them. Abigail studied the older woman with growing curiosity. "Why do I suspect you've been orchestrating more than just my comfortable lodging these past 4 years, Mrs. Wilson?" A smile touched the widow's lips. "Orchestrating suggests more control than any of us possess in this unpredictable territory. Let's say instead that I recognize potential when it appears before me, and occasionally provide nudges in promising directions. And you see potential in my connection to Standing Pine? I see potential in you, Miss Thornton. Your education, your adaptability, your genuine commitment to your students' futures. Your unexpected link to the Black Hawk family and Standing Pine merely opens doors that might otherwise remain closed." Mrs. Wilson rose, signaling the conversation's conclusion. "What you do with those open doors remains entirely your choice." As Abigail prepared for bed that night, Mrs. Wilson's words echoed in her mind, intermingling with memories of Thomas's parting invitation and Marshall Jenkins's cryptic comments. 3 different perspectives, each suggesting the same essential truth. Her ordeal had created unexpected possibilities that extended far beyond personal survival. Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of schoolrooms where Millbrook children sat, alongside those from Standing Pine, learning each other's languages and histories, while Thomas and Sarah Blackhawk observed with approval. Dawn arrived clear and cold, the temperature moderate by Dakota Territory standards, a promising sign for the journey ahead. Young Daniel Jenkins arrived promptly with 2 well-rested horses and an air of solemn responsibility that suggested his father had impressed upon him the importance of this escort duty. "Beautiful morning for travel, Miss Thornton," he greeted her as she emerged from the boarding house with her valise. "Father says we should reach Clayton's Ridge well before sundown if we maintain a steady pace." "Thank you, Daniel." Abigail smiled at the youth's earnest demeanor. "I appreciate your father sparing you from your regular duties for this task." Daniel's chest puffed slightly with pride. "He said, after what happened last time, he wasn't taking any chances with your safety. Said you're too valuable to Millbrook to lose to another storm." The simple statement warmed Abigail more than her heavy woolen coat. "That's very kind of him. I hope my teaching has justified such regard." "Oh, it's not just the teaching," Daniel replied with teenage bluntness as he helped secure her valise to the saddle. "Father says educated women like you are the foundation of civilization on the frontier, that without schools and churches, settlements like Millbrook would just be collections of rough men destined to blow away with the next economic wind." Abigail blinked at this unexpectedly poetic assessment from the practical Marshall Jenkins. "Your father has quite a way with words when he chooses." Daniel grinned. "Only when Mother's not around to hear him. She says his philosophy interferes with getting the chores done." The journey to Clayton's Ridge proceeded without incident, the trail now clearly marked by recent travel and the weather remaining favorable throughout the day. Daniel proved an attentive escort, pointing out landmarks with the keen observation of a young man raised to read the prairie's subtle signs. Though lacking Thomas's preternatural tracking abilities, he displayed a frontier child's intimate knowledge of the territory's features and potential hazards. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, Abigail found herself unconsciously scanning the horizon for the Eagle Rock shelter, where she and Thomas had spent a night of unexpected connection. Memories superimposed images of that snowy evening over the present landscape, the firelight illuminating Thomas's face as he shared stories of his childhood, the surprising ease of their conversation despite vastly different backgrounds, the sense of standing at the threshold of understanding. Previously close to her, "Miss Thornton." Daniel's voice broke into her reverie. "Are you all right? You went quiet for a while there." Abigail collected herself with a shake of her head. "Just lost in thought, Daniel. The landscape evokes memories of my return journey with Mr. Blackhawk. Curiosity bloomed on the boy's open face. What was it like, being rescued by a Lakota scout, I mean? Were you afraid? The question gave Abigail pause. Fear had certainly accompanied her initial encounter with Thomas at the abandoned schoolhouse, but it had stemmed from the general vulnerability of her situation rather than any specific anxiety about his heritage. "I was afraid before he arrived," she answered carefully. "Afterward, I felt safe. Mr. Blackhawk's knowledge of winter survival far exceeded my own. His competence was reassuring rather than threatening." "Father says he's not like other Indians," Daniel ventured. "Says he's civilized on account of working for the cavalry." The assessment, clearly repeated from adult conversations, contained layers of prejudice that Abigail would once have overlooked. Now, with a fresh understanding of Standing Pine and the complex balance the Blackhawk family maintained between traditions, she felt compelled to offer correction. "Mr. Blackhawk is educated in both Lakota and white traditions," she explained. "His command of English and understanding of military protocol don't make him civilized in comparison to his people. They merely give him tools to navigate between different worlds. The Lakota have their own sophisticated civilization with complex social structures, educational systems, and spiritual traditions." Daniel looked skeptical. "But they live in teepees. They don't have proper towns or schools. Some bands continue to follow traditional seasonal movements, living in dwellings perfectly adapted to that lifestyle," Abigail countered. "But Standing Pine, Mr. Blackhawk's community, consists primarily of permanent structures, including a schoolhouse where his sister teaches both traditional knowledge and subjects similar to what I teach in Millbrook." The boy's eyes widened with surprise. "They have a school, with books and everything?" "Yes, Daniel, with books and everything." Abigail couldn't help smiling at his astonishment. "The world contains more complexity than we sometimes acknowledge." The remainder of their journey featured periodic questions from Daniel about Standing Pine, the Blackhawk family, and Lakota customs, each inquiry reflecting genuine curiosity, gradually displacing inherited assumptions. By the time Clayton's Ridge appeared on the horizon, Abigail realized she had conducted an impromptu educational session that might prove as significant as any formal presentation at the upcoming conference. Clayton's Ridge, though technically larger than Millbrook, possessed less charm and coherence than its smaller neighbor. Established during a brief silver mining boom that had faded within 2 years, the settlement retained the hasty construction and transient atmosphere of a community, built on speculation rather than sustainable development. Its primary significance now derived from its central location between several smaller settlements, making it a convenient gathering point for territorial administration. The Clayton House, the settlement's only proper hotel, stood at the center of the main street, its 2-story facade attempting greater dignity than the surrounding buildings. As Abigail and Daniel approached, she noticed unusual activity around the entrance, several army officers in uniform conversing with men in the formal attire of territorial officials. "Looks like an important meeting," Daniel observed, clearly impressed by the military presence. "Is that what you're attending, Miss Thornton?" I believe so," Abigail replied, her attention caught by a familiar figure descending the hotel steps. Captain Montgomery himself, instantly recognizable by his distinctive cavalry mustache and ramrod posture. The captain noticed her at almost the same moment, his weathered face registering surprise, quickly masked by professional composure. He strode toward them as they dismounted, offering a formal bow that somehow managed to convey both courtesy and assessment. "Miss Thornton, I presume. Blackhawk reported your successful return to Millbrook, but I confess I did not expect to see you at this gathering." His gaze shifted briefly to Daniel. "Young Mr. Jenkins, I believe. Please convey my regards to your father." Daniel nodded, momentarily speechless in the presence of military authority. Abigail stepped into the conversational gap with practiced ease. "Captain Montgomery, Superintendent Wallace requested my attendance to provide an account of my recent misadventure and rescue. I understand you'll be participating in discussions regarding educational initiatives?" A flicker of surprise crossed the officer's face at her knowledge of the meeting's agenda. "Indeed, the territorial governor has expressed interest in exploring educational approaches for peaceful bands not currently situated on reservations. Standing Pine among them." He studied her with increased interest. "Blackhawk mentioned you visited the settlement during your return journey. Your impressions would be valuable to our deliberations." The invitation was clear, if unexpected. Before Abigail could respond, the hotel door opened to admit Superintendent Wallace, whose florid face brightened at the sight of her. "Miss Thornton, you've arrived safely, I see. A welcome improvement over your last attempted journey." His attempt at humor fell flat against the memory of her near-death experience. Seemingly oblivious to the awkwardness, he continued, "Excellent timing. We've just begun preliminary discussions about the educational initiative. Your perspective would be most welcome at this evening's session." Captain Montgomery's expression suggested the superintendent's enthusiasm exceeded the original. A plan, but he offered no contradiction. Instead, he gestured toward the hotel entrance with formal courtesy. "Perhaps Miss Thornton would like to refresh herself after her journey before joining our discussions. The territorial representatives are not expected until dinner." Of course, Wallace agreed hastily. "I've arranged accommodations for you, Miss Thornton, the finest room available, compensating somewhat for the frightful experience you endured on your way to our last gathering." As Abigail followed Wallace into the hotel, she caught Captain Montgomery's assessing gaze, following her progress, not hostile, but calculatingly evaluative, as if recalibrating her potential role in the proceedings ahead. The sensation was disconcerting, yet oddly empowering. For the first time since arriving in Dakota territory, she sensed that her voice might extend beyond the schoolroom to shape policies affecting communities on both sides of the cultural divide. The finest room available proved modest by Eastern standards, but luxurious compared to Millbrook's accommodations. A private chamber with an actual bathtub, hot water delivered by an attentive hotel servant, and a small writing desk positioned near the window overlooking Clayton Ridge's main street. These amenities reminded Abigail of the comforts she had left behind in Boston, though she found herself valuing them differently after 4 years on the frontier. As she unpacked her valise, a folded note fell from between carefully packed garments, paper of better quality than typically available. In Millbrook, sealed with wax bearing no identifiable insignia. Puzzled, Abigail broke the seal to discover elegant handwriting she immediately recognized as Mrs. Wilson's. "Miss Thornton, should your discussions in Clayton's Ridge turn toward educational initiatives involving Standing Pine, you might mention that the widow of a former Fort Laramie quartermaster would be willing to donate suitable buildings on the neutral ground between Millbrook and the Lakota settlement. Property acquired during my husband's service remains in my name rather than subject to territorial allocation. Such a location might provide appropriate neutral ground for experimental educational approaches benefiting both communities. With confidence in your judgment, E. Wilson." Abigail stared at the note with astonishment that gradually transformed into understanding. Mrs. Wilson's nudges in promising directions apparently included material resources positioned precisely at the intersection of opportunity and need. The boarding house proprietress had clearly anticipated possibilities that Abigail herself was only beginning to recognize. As she prepared for the evening's discussions, Abigail felt a curious alignment of elements previously separate in her. Mind, Thomas's invitation to Standing Pine, Sarah Blackhawk's professional insights, Mrs. Wilson's strategic support, and her own evolving vision of education's potential to bridge divided communities. The blizzard that had nearly claimed her life now seemed less an ending narrowly averted than a beginning she could never have anticipated. When she descended to the hotel dining room that evening, Abigail carried not only the formal account of her ordeal that Superintendent Wallace had requested, but also the seeds of a proposal that might transform education in this corner of Dakota territory, and perhaps, in some small measure, the trajectory of relations between communities too, long separated by misunderstanding. Captain Montgomery rose as she entered the private dining room where territorial officials had gathered, his military courtesy setting a tone quickly followed by the other men present. "Miss Thornton," he greeted her with a formal nod. "We were just discussing the educational challenges facing isolated communities throughout the territory. Your timing is fortuitous." "Indeed," Superintendent Wallace agreed, gesturing to an empty chair positioned between a territorial representative she didn't recognize and a distinguished gray-haired gentleman introduced as Judge Harrington of the Territorial Court. "We're eager to hear not only about your remarkable survival experience, but also your professional assessment of potential approaches to the educational questions before us." As Abigail took her seat, aware of the evaluative gazes of the men surrounding her, she felt a surge of certainty entirely different from the proper Boston reserve of her upbringing, or even the hard-won frontier confidence of her years in Millbrook. This was something new, a vision of possibility catalyzed by crisis and nurtured by unexpected connections across presumed boundaries. "Gentlemen," she began with calm assurance, "before addressing my recent experiences, I'd like to share some observations about educational approaches that might serve both territorial interests and the aspirations of communities like Standing Pine." The blizzard that had nearly claimed her life had delivered Abigail not just to physical safety, but to an unexpected frontier of influence, one where a schoolteacher's voice might help shape the future of understanding between worlds. Previously divided, as Captain Montgomery leaned forward with evident interest and the territorial representatives exchanged intrigued glances, she recognized that some journeys once begun lead to destinations impossible to predict, but essential to discover. The assembled territorial officials listened with varying expressions as Abigail outlined her proposal. Skepticism from some, thoughtful consideration from others, and from Captain Montgomery, a calculating assessment that revealed neither approval nor rejection. Judge Harrington, the gray-haired territorial court representative, took meticulous notes, occasionally glancing up with penetrating blue eyes that missed nothing. "You suggest a school situated between settlements," Superintendent Wallace summarized, when she concluded, "where children from both Millbrook and Standing Pine would receive instruction in both traditions?" His tone conveyed polite disbelief. "Not precisely, Superintendent," Abigail clarified. "I envision a supplementary educational program, perhaps meeting 2 days weekly, that would complement rather than replace existing schools. Children would maintain their primary education in their respective communities while engaging in shared learning experiences designed to build mutual understanding." Captain Montgomery leaned forward, his military bearing unchanged, but his expression thoughtful. "And what practical benefit would such an arrangement provide to either community? Frontier settlements have limited resources for existing educational needs, let alone experimental programs." "The practical benefits are considerable, Captain," Abigail replied with calm conviction. "For Millbrook's children, knowledge of Lakota, language and survival skills could prove vital in this territory. For Standing Pine's children, familiarity with English literacy and Western scientific concepts offers advantages in navigating changing circumstances. Both communities benefit." from the reduction in misunderstanding that fuels costly conflicts. The captain's eyebrows rose slightly at her direct response. You speak of costly conflicts, Miss Thornton, a curious concern for a schoolteacher. Is education not fundamentally concerned with preventing future costs through present investment? Every child who learns to see beyond cultural boundaries represents one less potential source of conflict in years to come. Abigail met his gaze steadily. I believe the military budget for suppressing a single uprising would fund dozens of such educational initiatives. A murmur ran through the assembled officials, some approving, others clearly uncomfortable with her forthright assessment. Judge Harrington's lips twitched in what might have been suppressed amusement. A valid economic argument, he observed, though perhaps not the primary consideration for educational policy. Economic efficiency is merely one benefit, Abigail acknowledged. The primary value lies in creating communities capable of coexistence rather than conflict. Dakota Territory's future prosperity depends not on eliminating differences, but on harnessing the strengths each tradition offers. A heavy-set man with the florid complexion of a dedicated whiskey enthusiast harumphed from the far end of the table. Pretty sentiments, Miss Thornton, but impractical. Indians either adapt to civilization or fade away. That's the natural order of progress. Abigail recognized the speaker, Councilman Rutherford, notorious for his heavy-handed approach to territorial administration. She had anticipated such reactions and prepared her response carefully. With respect, Councilman, the natural order you describe has proven neither natural nor orderly. The costs in human lives, military expenditure, and lost opportunities for development suggest our current approach may be the truly impractical one. She allowed a small pause before continuing. The Lakota of Standing Pine have already demonstrated remarkable adaptability while maintaining cultural strengths. Their model of selective integration offers valuable lessons for sustainable development throughout the territory. Captain Montgomery studied her with increased interest. You spent only a brief time at Standing Pine, Miss Thornton. Do you consider this sufficient to draw such sweeping conclusions about their community? The question was pointed, but not dismissive, a genuine test of her assessment, rather than an attempt to undermine it. Abigail recognized the importance of her response. My time there was indeed brief, Captain, but illuminating. I observed a community that has maintained traditional values while adapting to changing circumstances, permanent structures alongside. Traditional dwellings, agriculture complementing hunting traditions, and most notably, an educational system that preserves cultural knowledge while incorporating useful elements from white settlements. She paused, considering how much to reveal of her conversations with Thomas and his family. I also had extensive discussions with Sarah Blackhawk, the settlement's teacher. Her insights regarding children navigating dual cultural influences proved remarkably sophisticated, perspectives that would benefit any educator in the territory, myself included. Judge Harrington set down his pen, focusing fully on Abigail for the first time. You mentioned in your written account that Thomas Blackhawk serves as scout for the 7th Cavalry while maintaining his position within Standing Pine. His dual role seems analogous to the educational bridge you propose. The perceptive connection surprised and pleased Abigail. An apt observation, Your Honor. Mr. Blackhawk's ability to function effectively in both worlds demonstrates the potential value of individuals who can translate between cultures rather than requiring one to surrender entirely to the other. Blackhawk. It's an exceptional case, Captain Montgomery interjected. Few possess his particular talents for cultural navigation. Few have been given the opportunity to develop such talents, Abigail countered. The educational initiative I propose would systematically cultivate similar capacities in the next generation. Superintendent Wallace, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the exchange, finally spoke. "This is all very progressive, Miss Thornton. But what of practical considerations? Location, staffing, materials, these require resources not currently allocated in territorial budgets." Abigail had anticipated this objection. "As for location, I have been authorized to inform you that Mrs. Eleanor Wilson of Millbrook has offered suitable property situated between the settlements. For staffing, both myself and Sarah Blackhawk have expressed willingness to contribute time beyond our regular teaching duties. Materials would be modest to begin, primarily resources for practical demonstrations of skills from both traditions." Captain Montgomery's eyes narrowed at the mention of Mrs. Wilson. "The widow of Quartermaster Wilson? I was unaware she held property in that region." "Mrs. Wilson has maintained a low profile regarding her holdings," Abigail replied carefully, respecting the older woman's evident preference for behind-the-scenes influence. "But she has long supported educational advancement in the territory. This property, it would be formally deeded for educational purposes?" Judge Harrington inquired. "That is my understanding of her intention, Your Honor. A neutral location, legally designated for shared benefit." The legal implications seemed to interest the judge considerably. He exchanged a meaningful glance with Captain Montgomery before making another note on his papers. The discussion continued for nearly 2 hours, ranging from practical details to philosophical questions about the territory's future development. Throughout, Abigail maintained the delicate balance between passionate advocacy and pragmatic assessment, conscious that pushing too forcefully might alienate potential allies, while insufficient conviction would fail to overcome entrenched resistance. When Superintendent Wallace finally suggested they adjourn for the evening to consider the proposal, Abigail felt cautiously optimistic. Though Councilman Rutherford and several others remained visibly skeptical, Judge Harrington and Captain Montgomery had engaged substantively with the concept, asking questions that suggested serious consideration rather than perfunctory politeness. As the officials began to disperse, Captain Montgomery approached Abigail directly. "A word, Miss Thornton, if you have a moment." They moved to a quiet corner of the dining room, away from the departing officials. The captain studied her with an intensity that might have been intimidating were it not tempered by evident respect. "Your proposal is unorthodox," he began without preamble. "Yet it contains elements of practical value that deserve consideration, particularly given the current tensions regarding Standing Pine's status." Abigail chose her response carefully. "Thomas mentioned that the band's situation is precarious despite their history of peaceful relations." "Did he?" Montgomery's expression revealed nothing. Blackhawk is typically circumspect regarding official matters. He seemed concerned about potential relocation orders. The captain's gaze sharpened. He had reason to be. Pressure from territorial mining interests has been substantial. The discovery of coal deposits has complicated what was already a delicate situation. "And your position on the matter, Captain?" Montgomery considered her for a long moment before responding. "My position, Miss Thornton, is that unnecessary conflicts waste military resources and human lives. Standing Pine has maintained peaceful relations and adapted substantially to changing circumstances. Forcing their relocation creates problems where none currently exist." He glanced toward the departing officials. "Unfortunately, not all decision-makers share my practical assessment. Some see only resources to be exploited or grand visions of progress requiring conformity." "And how does my educational proposal intersect with these considerations?" Abigail asked, suspecting the captain's interest extended beyond pedagogical theory. A hint of approval crossed his features, acknowledgement of her perception. "A community with established educational ties to white settlements becomes more difficult to summarily displace. Legal precedents exist for protecting infrastructure serving both native and white populations. Judge Harrington is well aware of these precedents. The strategic implications clarified instantly. Her educational initiative, if established, could provide Standing Pine with additional legal protection against forced relocation, a shield of paperwork and precedent against political pressure. For their removal, I propose this initiative based on educational merits, Abigail said carefully, and it will be evaluated on those merits, Montgomery assured her. But wise administrators recognize when multiple objectives can be served by a single well-designed program. He straightened, military formality returning to his bearing. I look forward to tomorrow's continued discussions, Miss Thornton. Your perspective has been illuminating. After the captain's departure, Abigail remained in the dining room, processing the layers of implication in their exchange. What had begun as her personal vision of educational bridge building had unexpectedly intersected with territorial politics at the highest level. The responsibility was both exhilarating and sobering. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of a hotel servant bearing a folded note. "Delivered for you just now, miss," the young man explained before withdrawing discreetly. The paper was rough-textured, different from the hotel's stationery. Abigail unfolded it to find a message written in a bold, distinctive hand. "Arrived at Fort Laramie with news of developments at Standing Pine. Will reach Clayton's Ridge by morning. Information relevant to your discussions." TB. The initials sent a surge of both anticipation and anxiety through Abigail. Thomas was coming to Clayton's Ridge with information potentially significant to the territorial discussions. The timing seemed both fortuitous and concerning. What developments at Standing Pine required such urgent communication? Sleep proved elusive that night despite the comfort of the hotel's accommodations. Abigail's mind cycled through possibilities and contingencies, strategic considerations intertwining with more personal reflections on Thomas's imminent arrival. Their connection, forged in crisis and deepened through their shared journey, existed in a liminal space between professional alliance and something more complex that neither had fully articulated. Dawn found her at the writing desk, finalizing notes for the day's discussions. The knock at her door came earlier than expected, not the hotel's breakfast service, but Daniel Jenkins, looking both excited and anxious. "Miss Thornton, there's a Lakota scout downstairs asking for you." The hotel manager wasn't going to let him in, but Captain Montgomery intervened. The boy's words tumbled out in a rush. "It's the same man who rescued you, isn't it? Father said he might come." "Yes, Daniel. It's Mr. Blackhawk." Abigail maintained a composed exterior despite the quickening of her pulse. "Please tell him I'll be down shortly." She found Thomas in the hotel's small sitting room, standing with characteristic stillness before the fireplace, while Captain Montgomery leaned against the mantel in relaxed conversation. Both men turned at her entrance, their expressions suggesting a momentary interruption to a substantive exchange. "Miss Thornton," Montgomery acknowledged with a formal nod. "Blackhawk has brought information relevant to our discussions. I took the liberty of providing preliminary context regarding your proposal." Thomas's gaze met hers with quiet intensity. "The captain suggests your educational initiative might benefit Standing Pine in ways beyond knowledge transfer." "That possibility has been raised," Abigail confirmed carefully, "though the program's primary value remains educational." A hint of approval flickered in Thomas's dark eyes, recognition of her diplomatic response. "The timing is fortuitous. Standing Pine's Council met 3 days ago to discuss their own proposal for increased educational exchange." This revelation surprised both Abigail and Captain Montgomery. "Your father mentioned no such plans during my visit," Abigail noted. The council reached consensus only after your departure, Thomas explained. Your visit, and more specifically, your professional exchange with my sister, catalyzed discussions that had been theoretical before. Sarah convinced the elders that practical educational cooperation offered benefits worth pursuing. Captain Montgomery absorbed this information with evident interest. This alignment of initiatives strengthens the case considerably. A proposal supported by both communities demonstrates mutual interest rather than imposed policy. Precisely, Thomas agreed. Standing Pines Council has drafted a formal request for educational cooperation with specific proposals for knowledge exchange. He withdrew a carefully folded document from inside his jacket. My father asked me to deliver this to the territorial representatives as official communication from our band. The document, written in both Lakota and English on durable parchment, represented something unprecedented in Abigail's experience. A native community proactively proposing terms of engagement rather than merely responding to white initiatives. The symbolic importance was clearly not lost on Captain Montgomery, whose expression reflected professional assessment of shifting diplomatic terrain. This should be presented at today's session, he decided. The territorial representatives need to understand that Standing Pine is approaching this as an equal partner, not merely accepting terms established without their input. As they prepared to join the officials gathering for the morning session, Thomas drew Abigail aside for a moment of private conversation. You've created quite a stir among the territorial leadership, he observed, his tone lighter than his formal demeanor before the captain. Montgomery speaks of your proposal with unexpected respect. The idea seems to serve multiple interests, Abigail replied. Educational advancement, peaceful relations, and possibly protection for Standing Pine's current location. Thomas studied her with quiet intensity. You've aligned forces that rarely find common purpose. It's impressive. The simple compliment affected Abigail more deeply than flowery praise might have. I'm merely building on connections that began with our journey. Speaking of which, she hesitated, uncertain how to frame the personal question amidst political considerations. Was Standing Pine's educational proposal your sister's initiative, or did you advocate for it as well? A rare smile softened his features. Sarah developed the educational framework, but I may have emphasized certain strategic advantages to the council. My father recognized the potential immediately. Strategic advantages beyond education? Abigail pressed gently. Thomas's expression grew serious. Standing Pine exists in the space between worlds, Abigail, neither fully traditional nor assimilated into white society. It's a precarious position, one that requires constant adaptation and strategic alliance. He glanced toward the meeting room where officials were gathering. Your proposal offers a bridge that serves both communities while providing Standing Pine with additional security through institutional connection. The honesty of his assessment, acknowledging both educational value and political strategy, touched Abigail deeply. Their shared understanding had evolved beyond personal connection to encompass a vision of community transformation. Before she could respond, Captain Montgomery approached, signaling time to join the territorial representatives. Ready, Miss Thornton? Black Hawk? The officials are assembled, and Judge Harrington seems particularly interested in Standing Pines. Formal communication. The morning session proceeded with unexpected momentum. Judge Harrington, after reviewing the document from Standing Pines Council, indicated to Superintendent Wallace that the alignment of community interests represented a significant development. Captain Montgomery provided military context regarding the practical benefits of strengthened relations with peaceful bands, while Thomas offered measured insights regarding Standing Pine's commitment to educational advancement. Throughout, Abigail elaborated on practical implementation details, the shared curriculum focusing on complementary knowledge from both traditions, the rotating instruction that would involve teachers from both communities, and the neutral location that would symbolize equal partnership. Even Councilman Rutherford's objections seemed perfunctory rather than adamant, his earlier opposition softened by the evident alignment of territorial interests with the proposed initiative. By midday, Superintendent Wallace was discussing specific budget allocations and reporting requirements rather than questioning the fundamental concept. During a brief recess, Judge Harrington approached Abigail with Thomas by her side. "Your proposal appears headed for approval, Miss Thornton. Quite an achievement for what began as a simple account of survival during a blizzard." The blizzard merely revealed connections that already existed beneath the surface, Abigail replied. Like the prairie after a storm, where paths hidden by normal conditions suddenly become visible to those who know how to see them. The judge's eyebrows rose at her poetic turn of phrase. An apt metaphor. His gaze shifted to Thomas. "Mr. Blackhawk, your community's formal proposal demonstrates remarkable foresight. I'm particularly impressed by the specific protections requested for traditional knowledge incorporated into the curriculum." "My sister deserves credit for those provisions," Thomas acknowledged. Her experience teaching children from both traditions informed her understanding of necessary safeguards. "I would be interested in meeting this remarkably foresighted educator," Harrington commented, "perhaps when the initiative is formally established." "I'm certain Sarah would welcome such an exchange," Thomas replied with careful diplomacy. As the judge moved away to confer with Captain Montgomery, Abigail found herself momentarily alone with Thomas in the crowded room, a pocket of shared understanding amid the swirl of political maneuvering. "It seems our journeys have aligned in unexpected ways," she observed quietly. "The Lakota have a saying," Thomas replied, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "The path reveals itself to those who walk with open eyes. I believe your eyes were opened by the storm, just as mine were opened by finding you in its aftermath." The simple statement contained layers of meaning that resonated deeply with Abigail's own sense of transformation. Before she could respond, Superintendent Wallace called the session back to order, announcing the Territorial Committee's preliminary approval of the educational initiative, subject to formal documentation and resource allocation. "We will establish an implementation committee to oversee development," Wallace declared, with the enthusiasm of a man claiming credit for others' inspiration. "Miss Thornton, your role as primary representative from Millbrook seems appropriate given your central involvement in the concept. Standing Pine will, of course, designate their own representative." Thomas inclined his head slightly. "The Council has authorized me to serve in that capacity, working alongside my sister, who will develop curriculum elements drawing from Lakota traditions." The announcement sent a ripple of reaction through Abigail that she struggled to contain behind a composed exterior. Thomas would be her counterpart in developing the initiative, a partnership extending beyond their shared journey into the creation of something potentially transformative for both communities. As the session concluded with procedural details and scheduling of future meetings, Abigail found herself at a new threshold. Not merely the survivalist emerging from a deadly blizzard or the teacher expanding her educational vision, but a builder of bridges between worlds previously separated by misunderstanding and fear. "Captain," Montgomery approached as the officials dispersed, his expression reflecting professional satisfaction. "Congratulations, Miss Thornton. Your educational initiative has secured not only approval, but remarkable support across factions not known. For agreement. Thank you, Captain, though success will ultimately be measured by implementation rather than approval. Indeed. His gaze shifted to Thomas, who stood nearby in conversation with Judge Harrington. Working with Blackhawk should prove educational in itself. His perspective offers insights rarely available to territorial administrators. The comment contained layers of meaning that Abigail was beginning to recognize as characteristic of frontier diplomacy. Acknowledgement of Thomas's value cloaked in professional assessment. I look forward to the collaboration, she replied with matching diplomacy. Montgomery's expression suggested he caught more than her words conveyed. No doubt. Shared purpose often creates unexpected connections. He bowed slightly. Safe journey. Back to Millbrook, Miss Thornton. I suspect we'll be seeing more of each other as this initiative develops. As the captain departed, Thomas concluded his conversation with the judge and moved to Abigail's side. It appears we have been assigned to build a bridge together, he observed, the formal phrasing containing an undertone of personal significance. A bridge between worlds, Abigail agreed, though I suspect the construction process may face challenges from both shores. Thomas's rare smile transformed his usually stoic features. All worthwhile bridges do, Abigail. The question is whether the builders possess sufficient vision to see beyond immediate obstacles to the connection that lies beyond. In that moment, standing amid the political currents of territorial administration, Abigail recognized that the blizzard that had nearly claimed her life had instead delivered her to an unexpected frontier, one where personal transformation and community evolution intertwined in ways that might reshape understanding far beyond the abandoned schoolhouse where their journey began. Spring sunshine bathed the simple wooden structure that stood on neutral ground between Millbrook and Standing Pine. Neither fully Western in design nor traditionally Lakota, the building represented something new in Dakota territory, architecture that honored both traditions while creating space for shared knowledge. Children's voices drifted through the open windows, some speaking English, others Lakota, many switching fluidly between languages as they worked together on the day's lesson. Inside, Abigail moved between groups of students, her formerly proper Boston attire now complemented by beaded accessories made by Hannah Blackhawk, symbolic of her own transformation. Miss Thornton, called Timothy Reynolds, now 13 and one of the program's most enthusiastic participants. Joseph taught me how to track 3 different animals this morning. Can I show the younger children tomorrow? An excellent idea, Abigail agreed. Perhaps you and Joseph could prepare a demonstration together. Across the room, Sarah Blackhawk smiled at the exchange as she guided another group through traditional plant identification, knowledge increasingly valued by Millbrook's families as beneficial for survival on the frontier. The sisters-in-law shared a look of quiet satisfaction at the natural collaboration developing between children once separated by cultural boundaries. Outside, Thomas dismounted from his horse, returning from his latest scouting assignment. Though still serving as liaison between the 7th Cavalry and Standing Pine, his role had evolved as the educational initiative's success attracted territorial attention. Captain Montgomery now deployed him specifically to identify other communities, where similar programs might bridge divides through shared learning. Abigail joined him on the porch as the day's lessons concluded. Children streamed past, calling farewells in both languages before separating into groups, heading toward their respective communities. Though increasingly, play continued regardless of heritage, the boundaries between settlements growing more permeable with each passing season. Judge Harrington's report to the territorial governor was approved. Thomas informed her, his customary reserve softened by evident satisfaction. Standing Pine's land rights have been formally secured on grounds of essential educational infrastructure, serving multiple communities. The victory represented 2 years of patient work, countless meetings, carefully documented successes, and strategic alliance building that had transformed an emergency shelter during a blizzard into a model for territorial cooperation. "Mrs. Wilson will be pleased," Abigail observed with a smile, "though she'll pretend surprise when the news reaches Millbrook." "My father suggests we've merely won one battle, not the war," Thomas cautioned, ever the pragmatic scout. "But it's a significant victory nonetheless." As the last children disappeared over the ridge toward Millbrook, Abigail gazed at the horizon where Dakota's endless prairie met the vast sky. "When I took shelter in that abandoned schoolhouse during the blizzard, I thought my journey was ending. I never imagined it was merely the beginning." Thomas's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining in the casual intimacy they now allowed themselves. The gold band on her finger caught the late afternoon light, a recent addition that had surprised no one in either community save perhaps themselves. "The Lakota say that sometimes we must become lost to find our true path," Thomas replied softly. "You became lost in a blizzard and found my way home." Abigail completed the thought, squeezing his hand. Together they watched the sunset paint. The prairie in brilliant hues of orange and gold, a schoolteacher from Boston, and a Lakota scout standing at the threshold of a future neither could have imagined before a Dakota blizzard changed both their paths forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.